Hey, this is Dane from featherprop.com. Thanks for joining me again today. I have been walking through the Olivet Discourse section by section, providing some thoughts regarding this very famous, very popular, and very controversial section or passage. And I just do want to say that the things that I'm sharing, the ideas that I have here regarding this and my view of it, in my opinion, it's not essential that anybody agrees with me. It's not essential that I convince you of my opinion. Someone can have a completely different opinion of this passage, and as far as I'm concerned, that person can still be a brother or sister of mine. If they're in love with Jesus, if they're trying to serve Jesus, then they are a brother or sister of mine. It's not important that people see my point of view. I think this is just really for edification, just to understand other points of view, and perhaps for someone to see how another person thinks through this passage. So before I jump into today's topic, which is the parable of the fig tree, I want to talk about a passage of scripture that I missed in last video, where I talked about the signs in the heaven. A viewer, Vince, pointed out, and thank you, Vince, for doing this, that I missed the section of verse 30 in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. And I do want to address it because it is important. It was in my notes and I just blew right by it. And so I want to go back and quickly address that and then go on with the other passage. So Matthew chapter 24 and verse 30, the verse reads, Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And I talked about the sign of the Son of Man appearing, but I didn't talk about all the peoples of the earth, or in fact, what I just read there is actually the New International Version, and I don't particularly read that passage, but I want to make a point with that. This is commonly seen that, well, this has to be about Christ's second coming, not about 70 AD, because everybody on earth is going to see him, and not everybody on earth saw him when he returned in judgment in 70 AD through the Roman soldiers, and that is true. The world didn't see him. But the problem is on how that verse is translated. And matter of fact, in the NIV, which I just read for you, you'll actually see there is a note in the NIV with that section where it says, then all the people of the earth. And the note says all the tribes of the land. And this is how the New King James Version reads. Then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming. Now, why is that important? Well, it is interesting. If Jesus is using language to try to convince us that everyone in the world saw this, the word tribes would be a strange way of putting it. Generally, if all the people in all the world are described, we might read all the nations. That might be a better way of describing it, because nations are not necessarily divided into tribes. However, there is a people that is divided into tribes, and that would be the Jewish people. The 12 tribes of Israel is often how they're seen. And so we know from the Greek here that the word is tribes, not necessarily all the people or all the nations, but tribes. And then the word that is translated earth here is the Greek word gay, which just means either, it can mean earth, the world, or it can mean land. And so context would tell us, does it mean land or does it mean earth, like the whole world? Now, when we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel and the land of the 12 tribes of Israel, we're really probably focusing on the nation Israel, what we would call modern-day Palestine area. And if that's the case, if Jesus said that the tribes of the land would mourn, then he might be describing the Jewish people mourning. Now, of course, the destruction of the temple would cause all Jewish people to mourn in 70 AD when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. And so another way of seeing this passage, in my opinion, and again, I'm not trying to convince you of my opinion, but I'm just trying to point out how I believe reasonably reached this conclusion, is that the Greek suggesting tribe and the Greek suggesting land might be a way of Jesus just saying that the Jews would mourn, not necessarily implying that the whole world would see and mourn, but just the Jewish people would see the judgment and mourn because of it. I think if Jesus were trying to convince us that it's the whole world, he might say that all the nations of the world, or nations of the land, nation of the earth. But to say tribes certainly would call into mind the Jewish people and not necessarily the world, who is not divided into tribes. So with that being said, let me jump into today's passage. A very, very well-known passage, and I believe a controversial one. Matthew chapter 24, beginning with verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place. I'll stop right there. Okay, so this is the parable of the fig tree. Back in the 70s, when I read Hal Lindsey's book, Late Great Planet Earth, he made much to do about this particular passage, as well as many dispensationalists do today. Generally, what we're taught from people who have this point of view is that the fig leaf is a symbol of Israel, and therefore, when it begins to bud, when the fig tree's branches are becoming tender and they're putting forth leaves, they're beginning to bud, that this must be a sign of Israel. And therefore, when Israel became a nation in May of 1948, that was sort of what started the clock ticking because of this parable. Jesus is using the symbol of Israel. When it puts forth its leaves, when it begins to form as a nation, that really begins to see the change. Matter of fact, Jesus says this generation will see, he says, surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place. And so Hal Lindsey would said that generation that sees Israel as a nation would see the return of Christ, and based on this passage. Now, I do take issue with some of that because I don't think that's the most natural way that we could read this passage. First of all, the fig tree, I don't accept that it is an established symbol of Israel. I know figs one time in one of the prophets, Jeremiah, if I'm not mistaken, referred to Israel as figs, not necessarily a fig tree, but figs. And Jesus did curse the fig tree, and I think that would be a sign of, in a sense, Israel's demise. Because they had rejected him. However, that's about it. There aren't, enough, in my opinion, places that the Bible uses the fig tree, which is clearly Israel. Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 11 talks about the olive tree, and that is seen as Israel. And of course, Paul picks that up in Romans chapter 11, where he makes a point and he borrows that imagery and he compares Israel to an olive tree. So we don't have, in my opinion, enough instances of where a fig tree is used and it's clearly Israel. But even if we did, I think we still have a couple of other obstacles that we would have to overcome. First of all, Jesus didn't say, when the fig tree puts forth its leaves, know that my second coming is near. That would make it very clear. He just said, the summer's here. Now, summer is not anywhere that I know a symbolism for the second coming or for the rapture or for end times. There's nothing in the Bible that would tell us that. He says when you see the fig tree putting forth its leaves, summer is here. Nothing about a second coming, nothing about a rapture. So why would we draw those conclusions? I don't believe there's any logical way to reach that conclusion. He just says when you see the tree, you know that summer is near. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus pointed out the Pharisees. He said, when you see the sky in the evening and it's red, you know that foul weather is coming. When you see the sky red in the morning, you know that fair weather is coming. He was just making a point about nature. When you see that sign, you can read that. And I think the point is the same here. When you see a fig tree and its leaves are coming out, you know that summer's near. In the same way that you know that, when you see all these signs that I just described to you, know that it is near, that the thing that Jesus predicted is near. There's no reason to believe, again, that this is a reference to Israel. And finally, to kind of drive the nail in the coffin of this idea, in Luke chapter 21, verse 29, which is the parallel of this, Luke, recording Jesus, writes, "Then he spoke to them a parable, look at the fig tree and all the trees. Pick a tree. It doesn't matter what tree it is. Pick a maple tree, for example. When you see the maple tree, when it's beginning to bud, then you know that summer is near. There's a hawthorn tree not far out of my window here. When it buds in the springtime, I know that summer is near. Pick a tree. He's not saying that this has to be a fig tree. So again, Luke includes any tree. So I believe that to insist that this is Israel, I think Luke kind of ends that argument when he says, you know what, it doesn't matter what tree you pick. And of course, those who think that the fig tree is a symbol of Israel would be uncomfortable with saying, an apple tree, for example, because that's not a symbol of Israel. So I don't believe that again, I don't believe this is a parable about that at all. Jesus is just making a point. You're smart enough to read the signs of the times. When you see the trees, you know summer is near. When you see all these things that I described, you know that the things that I talked about, that is near. Now, verse 34, Jesus says that, "Surely I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place." Now, again, Hal Lindsey and other dispensationalists are often fond of saying that the generation that sees Israel reformed as a nation will see all the things that Jesus talked about. Of course, I don't believe that's at all what Jesus said. He said that this generation will by no means pass till they see all these things. What does he mean by this generation? And again, dispensationalists say, well, this generation is the generation that sees Israel. I don't think that's the case. I don't even think that's how we could naturally read Jesus' words. Jesus does use the phrase, this generation, numerous times. And I was about to show you, in every instance, he seems to be talking about his own generation. Let me show you what I mean. In Matthew chapter 11, verses like around 11 through verse 17, we have Jesus talking about John the Baptist, and then he says in verse 16, "But what do I liken to this generation? It is like children sit in the marketplace and call unto their companions and saying, we played the flute for you, you did not dance, we mourned for you, you did not lament." And here in this section of Scripture, Jesus is basically complaining about his generation. He said, what do you want from us? We play a funeral dirge and you won't mourn. We play a happy tune and you won't dance. He's not talking about some future generation. He's talking about his generation, because it was his generation that observed him and also John the Baptist. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 40 through 42, we'll call it, "For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and indeed a greater than Jonah is here." Here Jesus is complaining once again about his own generation. He said that Nineveh would rise up in judgment against his own people. They repented at Jonah, but his generation, in other words, his contemporaries, would not. And so the phrase, this generation, is used here, not talking about some far distant generation, but his own generation. Matthew 12, actually just another verse. "The queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear this wisdom of Solomon. Indeed, a greater than Solomon is here." Jesus claiming that he himself was greater than Solomon. Queen of Sheba, she came from the ends of the earth to see him, and yet one is greater than him. And so he said she will rise up against this generation, meaning his own contemporaries, not some far off generation of people, but his own generation. Same chapter, Matthew chapter 12, verse 45. "Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there, and the last state of the man is worse than the first. So shall it be with this wicked generation." Here Jesus is talking, I think, about his own ministry. He was cleaning house, so to speak, casting out demons. And he said that if a demon is cast out, but that person isn't taken care of, that demon will return with 7 more. And he said, so it'll be with this generation, which I think actually did occur. If you read, again, Josephus, if you read about the fall of Jerusalem and how wicked it was, you could only come to the conclusion that this was a sheer demonic. But again, the phrase this generation, or this wicked generation, Jesus was referring to his contemporaries, not some far off group of people. Mark chapter 8, verse 12, "But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Or shall I say to you, no sign shall be given to this generation?" He was not talking about some far-off generation. They wanted a sign from him. And in this particular case, he said, I'm not giving you a sign. But he was talking about his own contemporaries, not some far-off generation. He was talking about the people that he was addressing, the people around him. Also, Mark chapter 8, verses 34 through 38, Jesus had called together the people, and he addresses them, and he said, verse 38, "For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory." He's called the people to himself, and he was talking to those people. And I believe in that text we also have Jesus, when he's talking about this generation, he is referring to the people around him, his contemporaries. So time and again, as Jesus uses this phrase, we find no indication, none whatsoever, not even the slightest hint that Jesus is talking about some future group of people. When he uses the phrase this generation, he is always talking about his own people. So when we come to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 34, and he says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place," I believe that Jesus here is talking about this generation, his generation. If that's the way we're reading the scripture the whole way through it, we see no other cues telling us he means anything else. The most natural way to understand this passage, that Jesus was talking about his generation. And this is very interesting, because he starts out this section by saying in verse 2, "Do you not see all these things?" And then in verse 3, when the disciples came to him, they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" And then in verse 34, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass till they see all these things take place." The phrase "these things." And so Jesus is talking about these things that he's just talking about. And he tells them, this generation, not some future, this generation will see all these things. And as I've walked through this section by section, I hope to point out to you that the very words that Jesus spoke did in fact come true. We have sufficient evidence to believe that the generation surrounding Jesus did in fact see the things that he predicted. When he uses the language that the prophets used, when he spoke like a prophet, when we take our cues from the Old Testament and even sometimes from the New Testament, we have sufficient evidence to reasonably assume that Jesus was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. Now, as we wind up this video, I'm going to pick this up in the next one, continue to go through the Olivet Discourse, and I'm going to show you where I think now Jesus begins to talk about some future events, and I believe the second coming is in view here, and I'll explain why I think that as we move forward. So I hope to see you next time, and come back to this channel. Thanks.